Well, what Jack, if you were doing the math there along the way, what Jack really didn't point out is in that now 104-year history of the Gillette News-Record, his family was involved with that for more than 70 years, which is a long haul, considering that it really began, his family's involvement began in 1920 or 21, somewhere around in there. So that's pretty remarkable to have had that in one family for all of that time. Jack alluded to the fact that I was going to talk about some of the current part of the newspaper production. I will, but the history is so much more fascinating, especially since it ties into the exhibit next door. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit nervous about this because I have Betty in the audience who can correct me, and Butch who can correct me, and the Ernst family who can correct me about some of this stuff, so I'm hoping that I'll get most of it right. The linotype that you can see over at the exhibit in the other room really transformed the ability to print and also to get more newspapers out there, because I think until that time most of it was done by hand, and it involved the ability to move that process of informing people at a much greater speed. Of course, today, by today's standard, it is remarkably slow, but at that time it was quite remarkable, and it involved somewhat of a simple process. When you look at the keyboard in there, you'll see that it's an entirely unique keyboard. I don't think that there's any piece of equipment that has the same keyboard that has. It's not, other than the fact that a typewriter key or a computer key would have the same little places where you stroke. It had unique characters. It had a bunch of different things. And not only did they have to typeset this stuff, which was given to them by reporters and editors and everything, they also had to justify it to make sure that everything came out by the line, which meant sometimes choosing where a word would be hyphenated so that it would fill the line, or I'm guessing perhaps even cutting a few words that reporters had in those days to make sure that it fit a little bit better. These things were all put into what was called a chase. Everything that you would see in a page from a linotype day. This happens to be a page from 1943, February 18th of 1943. If you can imagine a big picture frame, basically, that's empty, has no back on it, and is metal. That was what all of this stuff had to go in. It all had to fit and be tight in there, because when they picked it up, if it wasn't, everything would drop out, or at least some of the key parts of it would drop out, and they would miss a deadline, and they would have to start in all over again. So there were, you'll see, I think, over in the exhibit, a lot of little key pieces of leading and copper, perhaps little items, and to make all of that fit. They used metal type for the headlines, and they also used wood type for lots of times more for the bigger ads and stuff that they would have, and everything was in reverse. So this is something that my parents, having been in journalism and used linotypes and did all this, created for me several years ago. And it isn't exactly, those of you who've been in the printing business, isn't exactly right, because they did it too so that it could be read. Does anyone know what it says?
Turn it upside down.
Well, that's what they would do. Absolutely right about that. I'm not sure that this would be right this way either. Does anyone know what it says? Can you read it backwards?
God bless. I can't see all.
God bless the...
God bless.
BI. They made it for me when I was in college at the University of Wyoming, and I was the branding iron editor, and they made this so that I could put it on the wall. You've seen stuff like this, but you might want to pass it around and other people can read it. All of those things were fit into this chase. And it was read backwards again. The linotype actually was, I think, some of the earliest recycling. We have recycling now to be green. They did it because that was the only way to operate. They would do the line of type and create it and justify it and get it all in. And then once the page was printed, they would take all of it apart and they would dump it in the part of the linotype that would melt it all down. and then they would put it into a huge cast, basically, so that it would be ready for another day. And then they would do the whole thing all over again. They'd melt the cast down and start. These were called, actually, pigs. This is a really heavy one that you can try to pass around if you would like. One of the larger ones. Some of them were much smaller and melted down. There are some who would say that some linotype operators, not all of them, of course, but some linotype operators were a little cranky. Sometimes they were down in the basements of buildings, in a dingy part of the building, and all they were doing all day was breathing lead fumes. You know, and you had to wonder about the health sometimes, but also just their ability to stay sane after a while. All of these different pieces, though, would get locked into this chase on a stone, which is also back in the exhibit. And Butch was telling me earlier tonight that they were made of marble because they had to be perfectly flat so that everything would lay in there correctly, so that one part of it didn't raise up too much for the print. They would, on these, and they could sand down the marble, he was saying, so they could make it perfectly flat. They would get these all put in, they would take it to the press, the press operation would roll, and this was all in reverse, remember, they would roll the ink over the chase and the pages, and a big piece of paper would come down, and it would roll that so that the ink then attached to the paper and it would come up reading correctly. And I go into this process because it has changed only slightly in a very unique way through the years. And then it would go to a folder and you would eventually get your newspaper. It's much like a rubber stamp today. If you have a rubber stamp and look at it, the ink is on the rubber stamp, but it's reading backwards until you put the ink on it and stamp it, and then it comes out in the correct version. But dealing with some of that was rather interesting, and they became, all of the printers and editors and linotype operators became very adept at reading this stuff backwards and upside down. The biggest problems were the letters, almost all lowercase, L and number 1, P's and Q's, which could be reversed, and lowercase D's and B's. And if they were very good at it, they could read those and just automatically pick them out. And using what is called a makeup, a printer's makeup, which was this little hand device that they had that was about 1 column wide, a newspaper column wide, and very sharp on one end, and you had the ability to hold it in your hand, and you could just flip up those pieces of type and stuff that were very heavily and tightly wedged in there. Did I do that okay, Betty? I had to call my mother for some reason. Anyway, those